Thank you, Miles. Thank you for being here, Natasha.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
I'm wondering maybe if we could start with maybe that moment when you decided that you were going to be a poet. I know that you went to the University of Georgia. You worked for a little while as a social worker after graduating from University of Georgia. But there must have been a moment, I don't know if it was a poem or something someone said to you, your father, a friend, where you decided that you were going to go on to Hollins and get your master's there and then your MFA at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst.
You know, one of the things I've realized is that the more you tell a story about something, the more the story changes. And so for that reason, I keep trying to tell the truest version of that to my recollection. But I will say that as an undergraduate, I never took any creative writing classes. That was when you still registered by the alphabet, and by the time I registered for those desirable classes with the T, I never got to get any of them. But when I left, I tried to write a poem for the first time in undergraduate school after my mother died, and it was just an attempt out of sheer necessity to make sense of that loss, and it was a terrible poem. And I asked a professor of mine if I could bring it to her office to show it to her, and then I lost the courage to do so, and I never did. It's a good thing because it's a horrible poem that, you know, it had this image of me. Well, what I wrote was that I felt like I was sinking into an ocean of despair, and the word sinking went down the page like that, and there was that little pool of cliche at the bottom that the word just went right into. So I never showed that poem, and I had been an English major, and when I graduated, my father talked me into applying to Hollins, but as a fiction writer. So I went to Hollins thinking that because I had loved short fiction so much that I wanted to write stories. And in my first semester, I had Marianne Ginger, who's a wonderful novelist, as a professor, and I remember a friend of mine who was a poet daring me to write a poem, because I'd been saying, you know, I remembered how bad this poem from my freshman year had been, and so I knew I couldn't do it, but I decided to take the dare just to prove how bad it would be. And I wrote the poem, and actually it wasn't that bad, and I gave it to Marianne Ginger. I put her in her mailbox, and the next time I saw her, she came running down the hall to say, "Oh, Tasha, you're a poet." I think it had more to do with the fact that I wasn't a very good fiction writer, and she was hoping that I would find a new avenue for whatever talents I might have. But from then on, I started writing poems. And so, you know, one turns to poems not to write them sometimes, but to read them and to be comforted by them. So there's a different story about turning to poetry for that reason, which is also about grief for me. But a very different moment of deciding, again, to write them.
You know, it reminds me of that line in Auden's Elegy for Yeats when he says that Yeats was hurt into poetry.
Matt Ireland hurt you into poetry. By Matt Ireland,
exactly.
Well, I mean, it's a line that I say often, too, because I certainly feel hurt into poetry. I mean, not just by the tremendous grief I felt over losing my mother, but also, you know, having been born in Mississippi at a certain period in our history, and all the things that go with that.
It's fascinating that almost 30 years later, about 27 years later, you wrote a poem called Calling, which is about you when you're 3 years old. And of course, you hadn't started to write poetry then or think about poetry, but you sort of define that moment almost as a key time, or moment rather, in your life when you, looking back on that moment in Mexico, realized that was your calling. And I wonder if you could read that.
Oh, I'd love to.
It's such a wonderful poem. It's here at the end. I'll let you.
Thank you.
This is in your new book, Thrall.
Calling, Mexico, 1969. Why not make a fiction of the mind's fictions? I want to say it begins like this: the trip, a pilgrimage, my mother kneeling at the altar of the Black Virgin enthralled, light streaming in a window, the sun at her back, holy water in a bowl she must have touched. What's left is palimpsest, one memory bleeding into another, overwriting it. How else to explain what remains? The sound of water in a basin I know is white. The sun behind her, light streaming in her face as if she were already dead, blurred as it will become. I want to imagine her before the altar, rising to meet us, my father lifting me toward her outstretched arms. What else to make of the mind's slick confabulations? What comes back is the sun's dazzle on a pool's surface, light filtered through water, closing over my head. My mother, her body between me and the high sun, a corona of light around her face. Why not call it a vision? What I know is this: I was drowning and saw a dark Madonna. Someone pulled me through the water's bright ceiling, and I rose, initiate, from one life into another. Thank you. I think that's part of the story of realizing that no matter how many times I try to explain the moment that I decided to become a poet, none of it's exactly right, that there's so many moments along the way, and that perhaps that farthest back in memory moment is the one that initiated that genuine calling. Mm-hmm. I think of it also in the poem as a calling toward something else, toward not just the need to write poetry, but to have a particular vision about what it is I want to write, to be drawn to, as I am, deeply drawn to a sense of social justice. I think that for me that poem is also about that particular calling as well.
It's interesting because in Beyond Katrina, your book, Beyond Katrina, you talk about not being a religious person. And yet, at the same time, maybe you have, ironically, a more insightful ability or look into what that calling meant to you. The way you conflate your mother with the Black Madonna in that poem in Monterrey, Mexico.
Yes, I think that I was always drawn to language, and so the language of ceremony is interesting to me, and that those words that I heard on Sundays or during the week when the ladies group would come to my grandmother's house for Bible study, that they also had a secular meaning outside of what I was learning. But the imagery is something that I think stuck with me. And I remember being fascinated about learning that my mother, after her death, a woman who'd grown up in the Baptist church, had lived across the street from the Baptist church that her aunt founded, her whole life, became a Catholic convert. And I never knew this about my mother, though I did know that she made certain gestures that, of course, were Catholic to me and believed in certain other rituals. But I never knew why. And when I began to think about why, I think I was thinking about that around the time that I wrote this poem, too. I started thinking about that particular historical moment. And, of course, there are a lot of Black Catholics in the Gulf Coast region, from New Orleans to Mobile. And so plenty of people she knew would have been Catholic. But I also thought that my mother might have chosen to convert because the people in the Catholic faith, the church at that point was in the South a little bit out front of integration, and that the church seemed more liberal to her, perhaps, than the Baptist church she'd grown up in, and that would be one reason. My mother had been attending a Mennonite school, and the other reason is that I imagine that on that trip to Mexico, to be confronted with the Black Virgin, with an image of Black womanhood that she would never have seen growing up in Mississippi might be very attractive to her.
And a little exotic.
Because that would have been before her conversion.
Right, right. Fascinating. In more secular terms, I'm really you've talked about your inclination to witness to injustice and discrimination. Pretty early on, there's a poem in your first book, Domestic Work, where in more secular terms, you talk about advice that a woman named Sugar gave you. Is that her?
That's right. That's my great aunt Sugar.
And she was a friend, or
no, she was my grandmother's sister.
Oh,
my great aunt.
Your aunt. And she says to you, "Under ripe figs green, hard as jewels, these we save. Hold in deep white bowls. She put them to the light on the window sill. Tells me to wait, learn, patience. I touch them each day, watch them turn gold, grow sweet, and give sweetness back. I begin to see our lives are like this. We take what we need of light. We glisten, preserve hand-picked days in memory, our mind's dark pantry." And so I'm fascinated there just by that advice of an elder to wait, learn, be patient, because there is that kind of what you called measured syntax, patience in your work as well, which you describe as necessary really for being able to lift that heavy arm of history up.
Mm-hmm. I think of Sugar, my great aunt, as one of my muses, in the way that the poem suggests, because of that kind of advice that she would give. But she was also someone who was very precise about things, and I love precision, I think, because of that. She was also someone who would convey messages to you, not just with words, but also with gesture, which of course in the mind becomes image. I can remember a time that she came to my grandmother's back door. They lived side by side, and this was the same time that she was, we didn't know it yet, but suffering from Alzheimer's. So she was, we just called her senile, not knowing anything else. So she was starting to lose a lot of things, and so her communication became very different. But I remember she always used to make big preserves because she had this huge fig tree. She came to the back door one day and knocked on it, the kitchen door, and I opened it, and all she did was stand there and hold out her palm that had these 3 underripe figs in it. And then she said nothing, and I knew to take them and wait.
And they ripened. Fascinating. I'd like to turn to some of these magnificent images, paintings in your new book, if I could. I think you all have a little handout of these paintings. Natasha has written several poems in this book that are ekphrastic poems about these mostly Renaissance paintings, but not all, in which she studies the paintings, and in a lot of them turns these ekphrastic poems into extended metaphors. And Natasha, I would love you to actually start where you would like, with whichever painting you feel was maybe the impetus for this book.
Well, do you mind if I start with perhaps the second one, and maybe go to that one, the one,
not at all.
The chalk drawing.
Sure.
Which is about the poem, or the poem Knowledge is about this one. I think this one because it'll allow me to talk a little bit about process and the advice we get from other writers that can be so useful.
Sure. Yeah, I didn't want to presume and start with one that you didn't, because I sensed that there was probably one poem you started with, maybe not The Miracle of the Black Leg, which is the first one.
Right.
But although you decided to put that one at the beginning, but the chalk drawing, which is called Knowledge, is really one of the most powerful poems in the book. It's a little longish, but maybe it would be worth reading. How do you feel, or a section of it?
It would probably be easier to read that one than any of the poems from Taxonomy, maybe, because Taxonomy is really where this began for me.
Okay.
But knowledge is so crucial to...
Okay. There's a lot in there about personal histories, too. That's great.
Okay. You know, I thought, when you're putting together a book, you spend so long thinking about the right order.
Yes.
And the order shifted many times. Knowledge began the book at some point. The poem Taxonomy began it at some point. Okay, this is knowledge. Whoever she was, she comes to us like this, lips parted, long hair spilling from the table like water from a pitcher, nipples drawn out for inspection. Perhaps to foreshadow the object she'll become, a skeleton on a pedestal, a row of skulls on a shelf. To make a study of the ideal female body, 4 men gather around her. She is young and beautiful and drowned, a Venus de Medici risen from the sea, sleeping. As if we could mistake this work for sacrilege, the artist entombs her body in a pyramid of light, a temple of science over which the anatomist presides. In the service of beauty, to know it, he lifts a flap of skin beneath her breast as one might draw back a sheet. We will not see his step-by-step parsing, a translation, Mary or Catherine or Elizabeth to corpus, areola, vulva. In his hands, instruments of the empirical, scalpel, pincers, cold as the room must be cold, all the men in coats trimmed in velvet or fur, soft as the down of her pubis. Now one man is smoking, another tilts his head to get a better look. Yet another at the head of the table peers down as if enthralled, his fist on a stack of books. In the drawing, this is only the first cut, a delicate wounding, and yet how easily the anatomist's blade opens a place in me, like a curtain drawn upon a room in which each learned man is my father. And I hear again his words. I study my crossbreed child, misnomer and taxonomy, the language of zoology. Here he is all of them, the preoccupied man, an artist, collector of experience, the skeptic angling his head, his thoughts tilting toward what I cannot know. The marshaller of knowledge, knuckling down a stack of books, even the dissector, his scalpel in hand like a pen poised above me, aimed straight for my heart. So, thank you. You know, Mark Doty in an essay talks about how your metaphors go on ahead of you. And how one of the ways that he begins writing a poem, he's writing, this essay is about a particular poem called A Display of Mackerel, but how he just began by looking at the thing that struck him, that got his attention, and just describing it in the most objective terms that you could do, before he allows himself to make figurative comparisons that, of course, begin to reveal something about how he feels about the image, which then leads to a kind of insight about it. So when I saw this image, I didn't particularly know why I was drawn to it, but I knew that I had to start describing it and hope that the description of it would lead me to understand what it meant. But then as I began doing it, I got stuck because I felt like, you know, one never wants to repeat oneself. And to me, it felt like I was writing a poem that I wrote in Belloc's Ophelia, that it had something similar to that for me. And so I had lunch with Elizabeth Alexander, the poet, and I told her that I had this problem. And she said to me that whenever that happens to her, she decides to let the seam show. Meaning, in the middle of the poem, she'll say, "Why am I writing this same poem again?" Like that will become a line in the poem. And once I took that with me and sat down again, the turn in the poem happens in which, you know, I begin to see that everything in that room has always been speaking to me about something about the nature of my relationship with my father. And perceived and received knowledge across time and space, particularly that of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, which is very male.
Yes, and knowledge and...
knuckling down the stack of books. Yeah.
My father always, I mean, I have this lovely relationship with my father, but it's also a very difficult one. I think that plenty of daughters have relationships like this with their father, but I have the added bonus of my father also being my white parent. So it's not only a gendered complexity, it's a racialized one as well. And so my father could begin to sort of represent this kind of whiteness, enlightenment, knowledge, and I began to represent the dark other, who my father could say that his idea of truth was knowledge, and mine was, I just lost the word. No, it's, what is the word? Wow. I'm only 47, right?
It'll come to you.
And you just he had to say that like not being quite sure even. But mine was the more subjective knowledge, that his was truth and mine was
empirical.
Yeah, and he couldn't see that also is ideological. There's the word.
I knew it would come
My
to
knowledge
you.
is the ideological knowledge, and his knowledge is the truth, and not being able to quite see that even that position is an ideological position. And there's also something
because I don't mean to interrupt you, but not being able to see it because the eyes are too fixed on the subject or the object.
Perhaps that's why I use the word myopic and myopia so much in this book.
Yes, you have it in one of those the painting about the father painting the portrait of his wife and child. We'll turn to that in a minute.
Well, you know, one of the other things that comes in is that my father and I used to give readings together a lot.
Right.
And in those readings, we would stand together and read poems that spoke to each other. So we would read back and forth, not, 20 minutes of me and then him. And I remember whenever he would get to the moment in his poem, Her Swing, which is a lovely poem, it's very sweet, it makes me very happy, but at the same time, there'd be that moment when he gets to the line, "I study my crossbreed child." I mean, the line in my poem is actually a quote from that poem. Yeah. Whenever he would get to that line, I would always feel, standing there next to him, something like the Venus Hottentot on display. That all of a sudden I became that creature who was sort of turning around in her otherness and difference to be... and so the sentence to me, there are two problems with it. One is the very sort of 18th century classification study, the need to categorize and fix everything that you study. But then it's also crossbreed, because human beings can't be a crossbreed. So it is a kind of misnomer. Right. And it suggests that in the mixture, one of the partners is a little less human than the other.
In your poem about Monticello, that comes up. Enlightenment is the name of the poem.
Right.
And you're able to joke with him at a certain point in that poem, which is wonderful, because you arrive at that point on the tour at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home, where, help me out here, where you're I think about to tour Sally Hemings' quarters. Well, my father took me to Monticello the first time about 20 years ago or something. And so that's the last poem I wrote for the book, and I had to take him back there, I think, to finish the book and to write that poem. And we just were, just to tour the house again. And, a lot of things have changed in the 20 years since he first took me there. Okay, yeah. So the change is that
They now, it's the official position of the Jefferson Foundation that Jefferson fathered some of Sally Hemings' children.
6 of them.
And they say that now. The docent will tell you that when you go there. And that was never discussed before. And it seemed impertinent if someone, dared to ask the docent a question about that. And so, in the 20 years that have gone by, because they've acknowledged that, because, they're trying to sort of resurrect the slave quarters on Mulberry Row or whatever, that not necessarily calling their quarters the servants' quarters anymore, but using more precise language. The conversations that you hear have changed. I mean, my father and I walked around there and overheard people saying things like, well, she was mostly white, or how white was she? Yeah. It's as if once it was official that he had done that, then there had to be something else that made it so. Yeah. That's because, well, she was different. I mean, without saying she was different, that's what they were saying.
But in particular, there are those lines, the improvement of the blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites.
And so this is, of course, I'm quoting Jefferson there from Notes on the State of Virginia.
Italics, right.
That's right.
But at that point in the tour, you say to your father, this is where we part.
I'll head around to the back.
I'll head around. And he laughed, and I guess you laughed.
Yeah. It was one of those moments where, it just becomes necessary to have a little bit of levity. Yeah. But it's also wicked of me at the same time. I think, because I suppose I could just stand there while the docent says, imagine stepping back into the past, instead of thinking, really, do you want me to imagine that? Do I really want to imagine that? Things would not have been so good for me. And so, so I make a joke out of it. And it does allow for, I think in the moment that I actually did it, but even more so in the poem, it is my grandest attempt to make sure that this poem, which is very difficult on my father, as is the poem Knowledge that I just read, that we have a deeply loving relationship. It's complicated, it really is. And that has to do the work of that in the poem. So I'm glad I really said it.
I'm glad you said it. On the dedication page of this book, you say, to my father. Which is not for my father. And then in the proem, or the first poem of the book, you write a poem titled Elegy for my father. And the last line of that poem is fascinating, and I'm not sure I completely understand it. Maybe you could, I think I do, but I would love to hear you talk about it. It's a beautiful mythical ending. You're fishing. And having a wonderful time fishing. Right. And you write another poem later on called On Happiness, which we could talk about too for a minute. But I step again into the small boat that carried us out and watch the bank receding, my back to where I know we are headed. So your back toward where we are headed, as if you perhaps know where you're headed, but your back is turned toward it. Am I onto something there?
Yes, because the two words the few words that you didn't say were some nights dreaming, I step again into the small boat. Right. So I just will say that to the audience because, it is about sort of recollecting that particular fishing trip again and again. And so in a literal sense, it could simply mean that, the boat's headed that way. I'm facing the other direction. We've already been there in real life.
I see.
So my back is headed to the place that we're going. But it's about going to that place, which I think is a place of knowledge, a place of coming to finally recognize something that has been germane to our relationship the whole time, that gets played out there. And so it is a way of thinking about having to go down that path again and to see again everything that has brought us to the moment where we are. And the moment we are is, the difficult moment where I am the ruthless daughter who will, rather than experience fully the moment of fishing with my father, am already thinking of how it will be a poem when he's gone. So it's... And when I say in the poem, your daughter, I was that ruthless. what does it matter if I tell you I learned to be? I mean, the learning to be comes, of course, from my father. I mean, my father is a poet. And all of my life with my father, we'd be having a conversation, and then he would just check out for a little while, pull out the notebook he kept in his pocket, and write something down. And I was always certain that I had said something that made him need to stop and record it for a poem that he would write. Right. So I never felt quite that he was always there. And yet, there in the poem, in the fishing trip, I've learned to do the same thing. And I'm going to make use of it. And I know that there's something not wholly savory about that, but it's for me it's Yeats, you know, of the quarrel with others we make rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves, poetry. Yeah. So I have to acknowledge my own culpability and willingness to make use also of him.
So this book really represents a leap, in a way, for you into that ruthless area, which is your poetry. I mean, you're doing the same with these paintings, in a way, but you also interestingly acknowledge later on in another poem about your father called On Happiness that he perhaps gave you the permit for poetry, metaphorically.
Oh yeah, that's really, ooh. That's interesting to think of, but I think you're right, certainly.
You know, you say, I would give you happiness if I could, that unattainable fish, the salmon that always slips out of your hands before you can let it go. And then you say, and then is to recall the permit he paid for that morning. See it creased in my back pocket, how he'd handed it to me, and I'd tucked it there as if a guarantee.
You know, that's one of those moments that I'm really glad you brought that up, because, you know, if you're so focused on writing about the literal image, and I am like that, you know, because I write from experience in that way, I try to capture something precise about the experience. There is the literal aspect of that, and literally we had to buy our fishing permits that morning, and we got salmon licenses. We did not get trout licenses, so that's why in the previous poem I had to throw the trout back, because we didn't have a license for trout. Okay. But what happens is, figuratively, it really does mean something else, doesn't it?
Well, I didn't want to read too much into it, but...
But after everything I've been saying, how could you not?
But you moved from that unattainable salmon to the literal permit, and I'm thinking, I'm still in the metaphorical mode.
Well, all I could say is, well, you know, it really happened, but I know enough to, you know, you would tell your students this. It's not simply that it happened, it is what else you can make of it. And I believe that if we're precise enough about what really happened, that we can find what is figuratively true and emotionally true in another way. I think I just saw an interview with Stanley Plumley in which he says, why not just say what happened? Because sometimes saying what happened can lead us to... Yeah.
That's actually a line from Lowell's Eclogue, that poem. You know, why not say what happened? Yeah. All's misalliance. Yeah. And that is an enormous temptation, is it not? I mean, I love the way the permit is just folded sort of casually and put in your back pocket, and you end the poem with that. Yeah. Right. In contrast to those poems about your father and the Enlightenment and patriarchy and knowledge, you write a magnificent poem about your mother called Mano Prieta, which is the brown hand, which is more imagistic. And I wonder if you could read that as a contrast to what we've just been talking about.
Sure. And I want to come back to what you're saying, because of course the book is very much about inheritance and where certain things come from, which is sort of why we started with calling. I'm losing. Mano Prieta. The green drapery is like a sheet of water behind us, a cascade in the backdrop of the photograph, a rushing current that would scatter us, carry us each away. This is 1969, and I am 3, still light enough to be nearly the color of my father. His armchair is a throne, and I am leaning into him, propped against his knees, his hand draped across my shoulder. On the chair's arm, my mother looms above me, perched at the edge as though she would fall off. The camera records her single gesture. Perhaps to still me, she presses my arm with a forefinger, makes visible a hypothesis of blood, its empire of words, the imprint on my body of her lovely, dark hand. So, thank you. You know, one of the things, I will tell the true backstory, you know, and that is that in recent years, it has occurred to me that sort of the more that I had a reputation as a poet, the more people wanted to attribute any success or talent that I had as a poet to my father, because my father is a poet. It's a natural impulse that people have to do that. But it's very complicated for me because, as I mentioned earlier, it's gendered and it's raced for us. When I was growing up in the Deep South, if I did anything well, people would say, oh, that's your white side. Mm-hmm. As if nothing good came out of the part of me that was black.
Well, that's right out of Enlightenment.
Yes, and it drove me crazy. Mm-hmm. And in recent years, it's gotten even more pointed in that because my father is my white parent, he's also my poet parent. Surely all of this comes from him and has nothing to do with the imprint of my mother's dark hand on me. And so one of the things in my mind when I was working on this book that I'm not sure if people see or not is in a poem like Calling, what I'm trying to suggest is that it may be literally true that my father's a poet, but what drives me, what calls me to be a poet, that utter necessity may have actually come from the other side.
I think that's in Calling.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think she's been being erased as part of what made me. Mm. She's been dead a long time now. And so she's being erased in that sense. And if you notice in all the Costa paintings, that is also the case whenever there is the black African mother. Yeah. She's either so black she has no face or otherwise is erased. And the gestures of the father always seem like dominion, a hand draped casually that's ownership or something like that. And I didn't know, I thought that about it. You don't know until you start writing the poems.
In one of those Costa paintings, her face is so black that it eclipses the light.
Yes. Yeah. That's one of the ones you,
yes.
I think you got, yes.
Right, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. You said you wanted to return to that, maybe you did.
That inheritance, where it comes from, where... what created the calling? Because and also, this is a book very much about parsing as well, which is why knowledge becomes an important poem. The woman on the table is literally being parsed. She's being dissected. Right. And when I'm called a crossbreed, that's actually a parsing of me as well. Exactly. And, you know, the parsing that happens to Sally Hemings when they're trying to figure out the portions of whiteness, when there's the other, Dr. Samuel Adolphus Cartwright, who's dissecting the white Negro to prove the essence of black inferiority that, you know, he is sure is there.
In that vicarious moment when you utter with a kind of genius leap that you feel the scalpel opening you at that point. Well, I would like to talk a little bit about also, before we finish here, your relationship to the past. And also, you know, also, before I forget this, also you just talked about that dark imprint, and you talk about the dark pantry of your mind. The word darkness, I don't know if you're aware of this, occurs about in every other poem.
William Logan pointed that out.
Oh God, I'm sorry.
I do.
It certainly doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
But it's an enormously just rich word that never really becomes redundant.
Well, I'd like to think that's true because it's different every time.
Yeah, no, it is. It's different. Yeah. So there's the dark imprint. There's the dark pantry of the mind, and et cetera. But in these, but I made a few notes about the past.
Okay.
Which we all have a problematic relationship with. But you write about it over and over again, understandably, as a poet of witness to what's happened to you personally, the devastation of Katrina, to your ancestors and so forth. You quote Hegel, the past is a ruin, nothing, and yet it lives in images. How the past comes back as a single feather in one of your poems, because we can't ever get it exactly. It becomes a kind of iconic image, a red feather. It's fictive, but real. There's the meta-narrative, and then there's the narrative of the past, none of which are really perfectly true.
Right.
And yet, as a witness, you talk about the importance of including what the official document is omitting from the story. And one of your tasks as a poet of witness is to fill in those omissions. The word palimpsest, scrim, are used over and over again, as if you have to look through a curtain in order to see the past. The pentimento, you call it, often. What is home but a cradle of the past? And your poem Nostos is also about that. Memory and forgetting are intertwined. So having to live with this forgetting, remembering, and yet feeling at the same time the important compulsion to get it right, to tell the true narrative of what's happening on Route 49, right? It's being lost and erased. And will always be erased, and resigning yourself to that one moment, but also trying to remember, feeling compelled to remember. Because if it's lost, then there's an integral part of us that's lost.
Right.
Everybody, not just you.
Right. You know, I do think that my relationship to the past is one in which I want to restore those narratives, those things that have been forgotten and erased. And sometimes it's more like what Robert Hayden wanted to do, which is to correct some of the misapprehensions about African American history in particular. When people don't know the fuller versions of history, they can make all kinds of assumptions about people and their nature. I mean, it was remarkable to me in researching the Civil War for my book, Native Guard, how many people had no idea that nearly 200,000 African Americans fought in the Civil War. I actually had a man who is, well, one assumes that he's well-read because he's a huge collector of books, but I guess they don't necessarily go together. But he had a great archive of poetry. And I remember him saying to me that it was a shame that the biggest problem with, blacks in America is that they've never had to fight for anything that they've gotten. And I thought, wow. And it was one of those sort of, he was a donor, and I had to be really well behaved in that moment. So, but you hear these things all the time. And so, part of what I'm trying to do is to tell fuller versions of history, which I think that Americans can be proud of because it is our shared history. On a more personal dealing with the past, the necessity of making sense of it, remaking it again and again as we do. I think it goes back a little bit to, watching my father pull out those notebooks. And I think that what we write, what he was writing, I think even in his mind became part of the official document. And I've seen my father struggling with memory over the years. without him knowing how much he's lost. And so, you know, one of the things he'll say to me is, Tasha remembers everything, whether it happened or not. And so, you know, I've sort of, you know, struggled against that. I've struggled against sort of this great, you know, umbrella of tradition and knowledge that he seemed to have that could always somehow undermine any story or experience that I had. That somehow I couldn't have possibly perceived my own experience accurately. That someone else could and I could not.
Tough.
And so to write it is also to create a little bit of a historical record. And you know, and as I try to write fiction, that's a slip. As I try to write nonfiction about my own past, you know, this book I'm supposed to be working on, one of the things that occurs to me is that what is truest is maybe not my recreation of the past, not an autobiography of my past, but the autobiography of my mind at this moment, needing to make sense of whatever it is I recall and how I recall it. That's probably the truest thing. And that takes us back to what is true and the questions I ask in the poem Calling. Why not make a fiction of the mind's fictions? The mind we know that the mind works to forget. I mean, we couldn't survive if there wasn't things that we forgot. And then there are things that we try to forget. And then there are things that we rewrite without even knowing we've rewritten them, and they allow us to have another truth. So if my father's guilty of that, certainly I am too.
But you're really taking a close look at these paintings, which are fictions in a way, but they're also mimetic for you and for us. And that's really a conscious decision you've made to respect your reader's intelligence, to figure it out, to present it to your reader, rather than to say, well, here's what this means, or here's what this is, in a political or pedantic kind of way.
Well, I think you try to do that by, you know, thinking about what Mark Doty said again, just beginning to describe before making those figurative comparisons that really are how I see things. I mean, rarely do people, except for what's on the cover, do people get to see the images. I mean, and the risk of that is you look at them and go, well, wait a minute, I don't see it like that at all. And the fact that I can describe, you know, the guy who's knuckling down a stack of books has everything to do with how I see it. Like someone else, to use that verb, you know.
The knuckle. It's like that.
It's like, who owns history? Who owns knowledge? The one who can knuckle it down like that.
You know, there's some really key moments in your poems, and also in a few in Beyond Katrina, an anecdote you tell about that waiter, and also in your poem Southern History, where you decide just to be quiet. You know that what someone has said is atrocious or untrue or terrible, and yet you, I don't know, maybe for reasons you weren't even aware of at the time, decide not to say anything. And yet you tell this later. I mean, it's a very human tendency. I wonder if you could read Southern History.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Just as an example, and we can talk about...
An example of my silence.
Well, we can also talk about the waiter, too, who felt it was that Katrina cleansed the coast. That's the word you used.
Well, and that was a narrative that we heard a lot. It was thrown around, that idea.
And you weren't able to say anything to him at the time.
Southern History. Before the war, they were happy, he said, quoting our textbook. This was senior year history class. The slaves were clothed, fed, and better off under a master's care. I watched the words blur on the page. No one raised a hand, disagreed, not even me. It was late. We still had Reconstruction to cover before the test, and luckily, 3 hours of watching Gone with the Wind. History, the teacher said, of the Old South, a true account of how things were back then. On screen, a slave stood big as life, big mouth, bucked eyes, our textbooks grinning proof. A lie my teacher guarded, silent, so did I.
Yeah.
You know, my husband's a historian, and the one thing that bothers him about that poem is that he wants to not to take away any agency from me, but to suggest that in that situation, when you're a pupil in a classroom, you may not have the power to speak up and to contradict the authority. So I'm trying to take a little of the guilt or the responsibility for speaking up and blaming myself for the silence I maintained. And he'd rather say, but you weren't empowered to speak up. I think it's better to blame myself.
Really?
I mean, which goes back to my thinking about Yeats.
Yeah, yeah. And that waiter's comment, you would admit later on in that anecdote that you weren't really quite sure what he meant. You're kind of giving him the benefit of the doubt there, but you also bring it up later in, I don't think it's Liturgy, maybe it's Witness or one of the poems.
Well, I think it was a combination of those things. I think it was an act of kindness and giving him the benefit of the doubt. I think what I encountered when I was there was that so many people did want to talk about what had happened. And I found that what I wanted to be was a listening ear. I wanted to hear people's experiences of the storm and its aftermath without judging them or arguing with them, so that I could parse and make sense of all the different things that they might have. I mean, I think that that's, in some ways, one of the things you have to do to be a decent documentarian, to not necessarily interfere in that moment. Because I wanted to hear what he had to say. I didn't want to do anything that would ruin sort of what we'd built up over the time that he'd been waiting on me and my brother and Aisha. He felt comfortable talking to us. And I think he felt comfortable enough to say what he really thought.
Right. Speaking of your brother Joe, you talk about the silence you kept with him for a while, not intentionally, and not writing back, or not writing to him, but getting these wonderful letters from him. And then realizing that he needed to hear from you also. And my sense is that you've been writing him after that. But you also say very poignantly, how can I live when my heart's in prison?
Yes.
And that's a good question.
And it was a thing I didn't want him to know. What I tell myself, and I think I talk about this in the book, is that, I did everything I could for my brother, and I think, some of the things actually resulted in, him being out, and but it was all sort of, I would send him things, I would make sure there was money for the commissary, I would make sure he had packages and things to read, but no letters, which I understand probably would have meant more to him even than the objects, the things that I sent him. But I think that if I had done that, I couldn't have held back all the fears that I had about him being there, everything that worried me. And I wanted to present a face of strength and resolve, and that maybe he could feel safer if he didn't think that I believed there was something to be so worried about.
I see.
So even talking to him on the phone, I had to, fill that with things that didn't go down a path of...
Did he understand?
Oh, he did, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, writing the book made me, I talk about sort of realizing all sorts of things about myself and my relationship to memory and to the past and nostalgia in particular. But I also... in order to write it, had to have different conversations that broke those long silences with my brother. And so now we don't have them anymore.
Oh, okay. Good.
Yeah.
And
I think they're dangerous.
You talk about the treachery of nostalgia.
Oh, yeah.
And I think Odysseus, is it?
Yeah,
a poem about
that's right.
Your father. And there's a really wonderful story about you and your grandmother being out shopping together. And... she sees an old friend who doesn't know you, and she introduces you as Nostalgia.
See, the other woman tells, introduces her granddaughter and says, but her real name, and her real name was something more exotic and fancy.
Yeah.
And my grandmother says, well, Tasha's real name is Nostalgia.
And she thought it was true. No?
She knew that wasn't true. I don't know why, but the fact that she said it just made me think, I'm really upset, but I just got called out.
She called you say that. She called you out.
Yeah, and it made me think, why would my grandmother say that? But more importantly, the metaphorical possibilities of this moment say something to me about my own relationship to
You know what
to the treachery of it.
Yeah.
To want to go back to something that never existed at all, and to have created it so fully in your imagination that you can't even see where you are or where you're going.
Maybe on that note, we could end. You could talk a little bit about this poem, but Theories of Time and Space, which is a kind of credo for you in some ways. I think it's in this book, isn't it?
It is. It's in two of them. Yeah. I ended up starting right. Beyond Katrina with it as well. So I'll read this, and then maybe we can have some questions.
Sure, and you might want to say a few little things about that.
Well, the thing I will say just before I read the poem is that this is the first poem in Native Guard, and it is indeed the first poem I wrote for Native Guard. And I was thinking of it figuratively, the idea that you can't go home again. You can't go back to the places that you left behind, not because they're changed, but because you are. And it was Flannery O'Connor's, where you came from is gone, where you thought you were going to never was there, and where you are is no good unless you can get away from it. I've been thinking about that, and it was all figurative, but, and I turned in this book to my publisher in March of 2005, but by August of 2005, this poem had become literal because my hometown, Gulfport, Mississippi, was wiped out by Hurricane Katrina. Theories of Time and Space. You can get there from here, though there's no going home. Everywhere you go will be somewhere you've never been. Try this. Head south on Mississippi 49, one by one, mile markers ticking off another minute of your life. Follow this to its natural conclusion. Dead end at the coast, the pier at Gulfport, where riggings of shrimp boats are loose stitches in a sky threatening rain. Cross over the man-made beach, 26 miles of sand dumped on the mangrove swamp, buried terrain of the past. Bring only what you must carry, tome of memory, its random blank pages. On the dock where you board the boat for Ship Island, someone will take your picture. The photograph, who you were, will be waiting when you return. And of course, the literal idea at the end of that poem is it's quite true that before you get on the boat, someone takes your picture, you go out there, you spend a few hours, you come back, and the pictures are displayed for you, and you can buy it, but you're not the person in that picture anymore because of those 3 hours. And so the figurative idea of that constant change and the inability to return to the past.
Well, we'll take a few questions.
Okay, so questions. We're going to do a few minutes of questions and answers. Again, we have a microphone in the top area, and we'll have two running around in the bottom. So if you have a question, please raise your hand.
Hi, thank you so much. When you were talking about I'm wondering how in your role, in your public role as Poet Laureate, how do you manage the story about the donor? Really, how do you manage to sort of confront the authority you were speaking about, but also maintain the silence necessary in order to do what you do? And I think that you were talking about that in your work, but how do you do that in your public life?
That's a good question. I think that if I think about the donor story as an example of a kind of silent. I still do think that there are moments that you have to try really hard to be gracious and to understand a person where they're coming from. I think a lot of people say things that they don't realize are not very kind or gracious. And so it's always better to be the kinder, more gracious person. This is something, obviously, so many of us learn from our mothers. But at the same time, he said that to me, this must have been, 2003, maybe. And that was a long time ago. In the years since then, it can be said that I have gained a little bit more authority myself. And one of the things that I felt when I was named Poet Laureate was license to be the kind of poet that I am, to say the things that I must say, the very difficult things about race and American history and our ongoing perceptions and ideas about race, that sort of undergird my work, and this sense of a deep desire for social justice. I might never have said that that is the thing that is perhaps most important to me as a poet. Poets are supposed to say things like they love language so much, and I love language, but language in the service of justice, to me, is what's most important. I couldn't have said that all those years ago. So now I can, and I think I've been given permission. I might have even been validated for being just that kind of poet. So it means that I can, if he were to say that to me now, I might say something slightly different. I might say, oh, perhaps you should read my book, Native Guard.
Another question? Over here.
Could you say something about the process of becoming a poet laureate in the United States? The time span, how you're selected. Other countries have different times. England, I understand, is something like 10 years for the poet laureate there. And so could you speak a little bit more about our system here in the United States and how you got to be poet laureate and so forth?
Well, the Librarian of Congress is the person who makes that decision. Our librarian is Dr. James Billington, and he's the 13th Librarian of Congress, appointed back in the 80s. So he's been in the post about 30 years, and he's in his 80s. But he's a historian, and he takes poetry very seriously, which is wonderful that we have someone at the head of the Library of Congress who really cares about poetry. So I know from his wife that when he is selecting the laureate, their house is, their living room is just covered in stacks of books of poetry that he reads as much as he can. He does get advice from other people. I think he makes phone calls to other poets and critics around the country. He'll ask the outgoing laureate, I imagine, for different names. I can remember years ago getting one of those phone calls in my office at Emory and being asked a series of questions to first name some people that I thought were very significant American poets and why. And then after I gave my list, I was then read a list and asked to comment on those people on the list. And that was the year that Charlie Simic became the Poet Laureate. And I was glad because his was one of the names that, that I had listed. So, but that's really the process, that the librarian reads a lot of poetry and makes that decision and makes the phone call. Oh, yeah, the post is a one-year post that can be renewed for a second term. So I'm at the, nearing the end of my term, my 2 terms. I'll be done at the end of May.
Along these lines, it's a little follow-up comment here. I've heard that you're the first poet laureate to conduct office hours.
Well, so I'm kind of old school, I should say.
Yeah.
In 30 years, I'm the first laureate to move to Washington and be in residence and conduct office hours. When the post was still called the consultant,
right.
it was really a job, and people had to go and sort of be a librarian.
Right.
But not since in 1986, I think, that they changed it to the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry. Has it been anything other than just sort of an honorific title? So Robert Penn Warren, who had been a consultant, became the first Poet Laureate when they changed it. But, you know, the stories are that, you know, so Gwendolyn Brooks was a consultant, and she apparently answered every bit of mail she received at the library.
Well, I'd like to come to the defense, or at least raise curiosity or raise a question, which I don't fully understand, and I'm identifying, I guess, a little bit with Rousseau and Voltaire. We seem in this discussion, and this is directed to both of you, to take for granted that the Enlightenment is male and racist, and but I just to try to keep this brief, maybe opening a huge topic, but we know that the idea that men are created equal, despite the historical anomaly of the gendered term, comes from the Enlightenment. We know that the abolitionist movement is very much coming out of the moment of historically of the Enlightenment. We know that the French Revolution, which is embodied as a woman, is coming out of Enlightenment thinking, and that the male monarchs of Europe were deathly afraid of whatever that thing was. And I'm aware from some other occasions that we being contemporary academic humanities departments to some extent, take it for granted that the Enlightenment has this taint in some way that I truly don't understand. And
well, you know, I think one thing, first of all, is that we actually never said that the Enlightenment was male or racist. I think that's sort of the perception that might have come. But when I introduce those poems and talk about the Enlightenment, what I always talk about is how good the Enlightenment was, as you're doing, and how much it gave us, but that the complexity of that is also, at once, it also began to codify for us ideas of racial difference. That what's interesting to me about the Enlightenment is that it did both of those things together at the same time. And so what I'm interested in Thrall is the ideas that come to us from the Enlightenment about racial difference, these deeply ingrained and unexamined notions of white supremacy and the twin black inferiority that we see manifest around us all the time, and come to us from the language of the Enlightenment. How could something so wonderful at the time do something so not wonderful at the same time? It's like, how can my beloved Father also harbor notions of my difference that is a difference that is also in less than? How do those two things go together? My Father loves me, but does he also maybe think that the improvement of the blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites, is it possible to hold two ideas like that at once? Absolutely.
First of all, I am so glad I'm here. Thank you so much. I just feel wonderful after hearing you for an hour. My question is this: are you ever aware of your competition? When you...
Oh, no, the good thing is that you don't know that you're being considered. Wouldn't it be awful if you did? Sitting there waiting for a phone call? Yeah.
I was hoping you say you comment on the other people.
It's a big surprise. If you're talking about the time that I got that call, it would never have occurred to me in my mind that I would ever be a poet laureate. I was honored to be someone asked to say who the poets I thought should be. That's always an honor. I hope to continue to have such an honor, because one of the greatest things is being able to promote the work of people that we deeply admire. And that's one of the things I've gotten to do in this post as well. Thank you.
In your travels as poet laureate, has anything surprised you about what you've learned about poetry and its place in American culture?
You know, it's going to sound like a trite answer simply because I have read that other laureates have learned this same thing. I was reading not too long ago Josephine Jacobson's little pamphlet from a lecture she gave, I think in the 70s at the library. And she, you know, says in it something that is exactly my experience and echoes something, and that is that more people in America read and write poetry or turn to it than we ever would imagine. That it's a lot stronger. I mean, it gets, every few years, you know, there's another incendiary essay where a critic is talking about the death of poetry or no one cares anymore. And yet, it's not just people like you in this room who care about poetry. There are people I find who secretly care about it and don't mention it because they're afraid to tell someone else. Someone came to my office and he said that he had gone to his 30th high school reunion and got into a conversation with a woman who had been, one of the popular types when they were in school that he never would have thought would have talked to him. But, over the punch, they start talking about how they both secretly write poetry. And it is always like this little kind of confession or admission that somebody's doing it in secret, And it makes it kind of illicit. And if that helps poetry, I'm all for it,
We'll take another couple of questions.
We have a president who is a real poetry fan. I think he was seen right after the inauguration with Derek Walcott under his arm.
Oh, I remember that. That's right.
Yeah, very exciting for this tribe. Any interaction with him over your mission or what you're doing, or he's just too busy to?
I think mostly too busy. I finally did get to meet him and the First Lady at an event at the White House that was it was celebrating Carole King. She won the Gershwin Prize in American popular music this year. But no other kind of, I think much too busy in the last, for much poetry stuff. And I know that they probably wanted to, or had grand plans and intentions for more poetry, but yeah.
I saw you, Natasha. I saw you on the Charlie Rose show and the television show. Charlie Rose.
Was I talking to him? Oh, was a clip of me doing something?
Yeah, well, you were talking. It's a talk show.
I've never met Charlie Rose. I've not been on that show. Jim.
Jim Lehrer?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe it was Jim Lehrer?
Well, maybe. But
You've seen me on the PBS NewsHour.
Yeah,
with Jeff Brown.
I thought it was Charlie Rose.
No, Jeff Brown.
Oh, okay. All right. So you were wonderful.
Thank you.
Wherever you were.
You should tell that to Charlie Rose.
Yeah, Charlie Rose.
You should tell Charlie Rose,
Does that kind of exposure just really help poetry? Do you feel going on television, does it really help poetry?
Well, I think what you probably saw was my series with Jeff Brown in the NewsHour. It's my project, actually. My first-year project, if you could call it, moving to Washington and holding office hours. In my second term, what I wanted to do was to go around the country and showcase where poetry lives in America and the way that ordinary people make use of poetry in their daily lives to deal with various social issues. So the first episode, we went to New York, to Brooklyn, to the New York Memory Center, and a poetry program there that helps dementia patients. People with Alzheimer's live in the moment. And it was moving and amazing. The next one, we went to Detroit and featured Inside Out Literary Arts, which is almost 20 years old. Terry Blackhawk was one of the founders of it. And this is a program that goes into the inner city schools and deals with middle school kids and getting them to write poetry. They were, I think, the best spokespeople for poetry I've ever seen. When we sat down and interviewed 3 of the kids that we talked to, I said to them, what if you had to do my job? What if you had to go around and talk about poetry and to get people who think they don't like poetry to be interested in poetry? What would you do? And the young woman said, well, first, I would read them a poem. Brilliant. And she said, because probably, and then I would explain to them what poetry is, because if they don't like it, they must not know. And she was right. And then the next episode that just aired a couple of weeks ago, we went to Harvard Medical School, where the poet Rafael Campo is teaching a poetry workshop to the doctors there and interns, because he believes that it helps with empathy and helping doctors to treat the whole patient. We're on our way to Seattle for the next one. All that is to say that, the NewsHour makes poetry a regular sort of feature on there. Unlike other channels, you'll see their occasional poetry feature. And the hope is that people see it. But what we were trying to show, alongside the kind of features where they showcase a particular poet, was just people who love poetry or use it for various reasons. And I don't know, I imagine that people seeing that and seeing how moving it's been to the different people involved would change their minds about poetry. I don't know if it's having that effect. I can only hope so.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Please give our poets a